Have you ever stared at an impossible problem? One where all the conventional solutions have failed, where the rules of the game are stacked against you, and defeat seems inevitable. What do you do then? Do you surrender to the established wisdom, or do you tear up the playbook and write your own rules? Imagine a war machine that seemed unstoppable, an empire stretching across vast oceans, fueled by endless convoys of ships, delivering troops and supplies to its fortified outposts. Now, imagine a lone mechanic, a sixth-grade dropout, fueled by a searing personal tragedy, who looked at the greatest military challenge of his era and said, "There's a better way. We just haven't invented it yet." This isn't just a war story. This is a story about the relentless power of human ingenuity, about the courage to challenge dogma, and about how sometimes the most revolutionary breakthroughs don't come from grand strategists or corporate boardrooms, but from the desperate, inventive hands of those who refuse to accept defeat. It's a story about a moment in history when a medium bomber, designed for precision at high altitudes, was transformed into a fearsome flying gunship, bristling with enough firepower to literally tear enemy ships in half at wave-top height. On March 3, 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy was about to receive a brutal 15-minute lesson in adaptive warfare, a lesson delivered not by battleships or heavy bombers, but by an unholy terror that had never existed before. The B-25 Mitchell bomber, reborn with an 8-gun nose. And after that day, the Pacific War, as they knew it, would never be the same again. To understand the sheer audacity of this innovation, we need to rewind to 1942. The Pacific War was not going America's way. Pearl Harbor had been a devastating blow. The Philippines had fallen, Wake Island was overrun, and the Japanese war machine, powered by a fervent, almost fanatical dedication, seemed utterly unstoppable. Their strategy was brutally effective: expand rapidly, fortify heavily, and keep their distant garrisons supplied with vast convoys, protected by a formidable navy. General Douglas MacArthur's forces in the Southwest Pacific were barely holding on, stretched thin and outmatched. Allied bombers were attacking Japanese convoys. Yes, but they were doing so with the conventional wisdom of the day. Massive B-17 flying fortresses would lumber up to 20,000 feet, dropping their bombs from miles above, relying on gravity, advanced Norden bomb sights, and a heavy dose of sheer luck to hit fast-moving ships far below. The results were, to put it mildly, abysmal. Time and again, those expensive high-altitude bombing runs achieved little. Pilots would watch in frustration as Japanese captains, seeing the bombs tumble from the sky, would simply turn their vessels, steering out of the way as the ordnance exploded harmlessly in the vast expanse of the Pacific. Convoy after convoy reached its destination, delivering fresh troops, ammunition, and vital supplies to fortify Japanese strongholds, further entrenching their grip on the stolen territories. It was a tactical stalemate, a slow bleeding where America seemed unable to land a decisive blow. This was more than just a military problem. It was a crisis of morale. How do you convince your fighting men that victory is possible when every attempt at intervention seems to end in failure? How do you break a supply chain when your most powerful weapons are proving useless against it? This frustration wasn't limited to the high command. It permeated the ranks, from the weary pilots flying those ineffective missions to the ground crews patching up planes that often returned with little to show for their efforts. But in the dust-choked maintenance hangars and makeshift workshops of the 5th Air Force, amidst the grease, sweat, and despair, something revolutionary was stirring. It wasn't born in a sterile laboratory or a high-level strategy meeting. It was born from the crucible of necessity, forged by men who refused to accept the status quo. This movement, this radical rethinking of aerial warfare, was about to fundamentally alter the course of naval combat forever. At the heart of this brewing revolution was a man named Paul Irving Gunn. To everyone who knew him, he was simply Papi. A grizzled Arkansas native born in 1899, Papi was a sixth-grade dropout. Not exactly the profile of a military genius, right? But Papi possessed something far more valuable than academic credentials: an innate mechanical genius, an unshakable will, and a deep-seated contempt for regulations that got in the way of solving a problem. He'd joined the Navy as a teenager, dreaming of becoming a pilot. But without the education to become an officer, he was shunted into aviation mechanics. This seemingly lesser path, however, became his greatest asset. He learned aircraft inside and out, every rivet, every wire, every stress point. He saved every penny, bought a surplus seaplane, and taught himself to fly, becoming one of the Navy's rare naval aviation pilots, enlisted men who flew alongside officers, a breed apart. He flew from America's first aircraft carriers, the USS Langley, Lexington, and Saratoga, honing his skills, learning to improvise, to innovate, to make do with whatever was available. He was a master of mechanical adaptation, a true problem solver, long before the war began. When the Navy finally offered him a chance to become an officer, he was already 40, ancient by flying standards. But Papi had retired, chasing a different dream. He moved to the Philippines with his wife, Polly, and their 4 children, establishing Philippine Airlines with a humble fleet of 4 red Beechcraft aircraft. It was a simple, fulfilling life, building something from nothing, flying passengers between the islands. He was a pioneer of commercial aviation, a man who built his own dream. Then, December 7th, 1941, ripped his world apart. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines, Papi's family was caught in the maelstrom. Polly and their 4 children were interned in the notorious Santo Tomas camp in Manila, a place of starvation, disease, and psychological torment. Papi, narrowly escaping to Australia with a handful of other American personnel, had lost everything: his airline, his home, his sense of peace. But the Japanese had also awakened something primal and dangerous within him. They had taken everything from Paul Irving Gunn, leaving him a man with nothing left to lose, but with 20 years of aviation expertise burning for revenge. The Army Air Force commissioned him as a captain, not because he fit a mold, but because they desperately needed anyone with his skills. What they got was a man obsessed, driven by a personal hell, focused like a laser on finding better, more destructive ways to kill Japanese ships. Papi Gunn understood something that the high-ranking officers, often detached from the brutal realities of combat, didn't. He knew you couldn't sink ships from 20,000 feet. That was a fantasy, a statistical probability that rarely materialized. You had to get down low, down in the weeds, where the enemy could see the whites of your eyes, down where every bullet counted, where the impact was immediate and visceral. He knew that to truly stop the enemy, you had to hit them where it hurt, directly, undeniably. The fundamental problem facing Allied forces in the Pacific was simple but seemed insurmountable. How do you stop enemy ships when your weapons aren't designed for the job? Traditional naval doctrine was clear. Ships fought ships, and planes fought planes. But in the vastness of the Pacific, Allied forces simply didn't have enough ships to challenge every Japanese convoy, every time. High-altitude bombing, as we've seen, had proven spectacularly ineffective against moving targets. Bomber crews would drop their ordnance from 4 miles up, watching helplessly as Japanese captains would simply turn their wheels, steering out of the way. The bombs would explode harmlessly in the ocean, while the convoy continued to its destination, delivering fresh troops and supplies to fortify Japanese positions. It was a disheartening, morale-sapping cycle. What was needed was a complete reimagining of how aircraft could engage naval targets. Not from above, where ships had ample time to maneuver, but from the side, at mast height, where evasion was virtually impossible, and every shot would count. This wasn't just a tactical shift. It was a philosophical revolution that challenged every assumption about how air and sea warfare should be conducted. It was about audacity, about precision through proximity, and about overwhelming force applied where it mattered most. Papy Gunn, with his mechanic's eyes and his intimate understanding of aircraft, saw the solution with brutal clarity. Take a medium bomber, something like the B-25 Mitchell, a plane with good range, speed, and inherent stability, and transform it. Strip out the cumbersome bombardier equipment, which was useless in a low-altitude attack. Then, pack the nose full of heavy machine guns, turning it into a flying weapon platform. Teach pilots to attack ships not as distant targets, but as if they were strafing ground targets, up close and personal. Make the airplane into something it was never designed to be: a ship killer. This concept, however, required more than just mechanical innovation. It demanded a complete rethinking of bombing tactics. Instead of dropping ordnance from high altitude, these modified bombers would employ a technique called skip bombing. Racing in at wave-top height, pilots would release their bombs to skip across the water like stones, letting them slam into the sides of ships where their armor was thinnest, right at or below the waterline. This was the vulnerable underbelly the Japanese had never considered protecting against aerial attack. The beauty of Papy's concept lay in its brutal simplicity: overwhelm the enemy with firepower they couldn't counter. Japanese ships were designed to defend against high-altitude bombers and other naval vessels. They had elaborate anti-aircraft arrays aimed upwards. They weren't prepared for aircraft that could strafe their decks with overwhelming force while simultaneously skip-bombing their hulls from point-blank range. It was like fighting a knight in full armor but attacking his exposed feet. In the summer of 1942, working alongside North American aviation representative Jack Fox, Papy Gunn began his transformative work. They initially experimented with the Douglas A-20 Havoc light bomber, but it was the B-25 Mitchell that would become their true masterpiece. The process was part engineering genius, part audacious improvisation, and part organized theft. Papy and his dedicated crew would scavenge 50-caliber machine guns from crashed fighters, planes that would never fly again, their usefulness ostensibly over. But in Papy's hands, their weapons were given a new, terrifying purpose. They'd tear out the bombardier compartments from B-25s, replacing precision optics with raw, unadulterated firepower. They packed the nose with as many heavy machine guns as they could physically fit. The first modifications carried 4 guns, then 6. Eventually, some B-25s would carry an incredible 18 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, an unimaginable concentration of firepower, the equivalent of 3 P-51 Mustang fighters, each a legend in its own right, all focused on a single point from a single aircraft. Imagine that. A medium bomber with more forward firepower than any fighter in the world, but the guns were only half the equation. These radically modified bombers needed new tactics to match their new capabilities. Pilots had to learn to fly at wave-top height, often just 50 feet above the churning ocean swells, threading between enemy ships while under intense anti-aircraft fire. They had to master skip bombing, an art that required perfect timing, incredible depth perception, steady nerves of steel, and absolute unwavering trust in their aircraft. This wasn't flying. It was aerial ballet on the edge of catastrophe. The skip bombing technique, once perfected, was devastatingly effective. Flying low, Pilots would release 500-pound bombs that would literally bounce across the ocean surface like skipping stones, hitting enemy ships at or just below the waterline, the most vulnerable point on any vessel. Simultaneously, the concentrated firepower from the nose guns would sweep the decks clear of anti-aircraft crews, making it impossible for the enemy to defend themselves. It was a 1-2 punch: eliminate defensive fire, then deliver the killing blow to the hull. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, a man renowned for his own unconventional thinking, immediately recognized the potential of Papi's innovations. He was a leader who understood that sometimes the most effective solutions come from outside the established hierarchy. Kenney made Gunn a member of his personal staff, giving him carte blanche to modify as many bombers as possible. This was critical. Without a visionary leader to champion Papi's radical ideas, they would have likely been smothered by bureaucracy and tradition. By early 1943, entire squadrons of these flying gunships were ready for combat. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. Their intelligence services, rooted in a predictable, doctrinally rigid understanding of warfare, had no concept that American medium bombers could be transformed into such deadly anti-ship weapons. They continued to plan convoy operations based on the assumption that they would face traditional high-altitude bombing attacks they had successfully countered throughout 1942. They were about to be catastrophically wrong. The transformation of the B-25 into a ship-killing gunship represented more than just tactical innovation. It embodied a fundamental American approach to warfare that stood in stark contrast to Japanese military philosophy. Where Japanese forces relied heavily on rigid doctrine, prescribed tactics, and adherence to established hierarchies, Americans, particularly in the Pacific, embraced improvisation, field modification, and often a healthy disregard for rules when they proved ineffective. This difference in military culture, this clash of philosophies, would prove decisive. Japanese commanders had spent decades perfecting convoy escort procedures designed to counter traditional naval and aerial threats. Their destroyer escorts knew exactly how to position themselves to minimize damage from high-altitude bombing. Their anti-aircraft crews were trained to engage bombers approaching from predictable attack vectors. Their doctrine was a fortress of established wisdom. But Papi Gunn's modifications created an entirely new category of threat. These weren't traditional bombers following established attack patterns. They were hybrid weapons that combined the best features of fighters, bombers, and attack aircraft into something unprecedented. The Japanese had no doctrine for countering such weapons because no one had ever conceived of such weapons before. Their fortress of doctrine suddenly had a gaping, undefended door. Let's consider this in a broader context of innovation. Think of moments in business or technology where a disruptor comes along, not playing by the old rules, but rewriting them entirely. Companies like Uber didn't invent transportation, but they reinvented how people access it. Apple didn't invent phones, but they redefined what a phone could be. Papi Gunn was doing precisely this in warfare. He wasn't inventing airplanes, but he was radically redefining their purpose and application. This kind of innovation often emerges from the periphery, from those unburdened by the central establishment's assumptions. The moral implications of this innovation were equally significant. Skip bombing and low-level strafing made air attacks against ships far more personal and immediate than high-altitude bombing. Pilots, racing in at 50 feet, could see individual sailors on enemy decks. They could watch, in horrifying detail, the immediate effects of their gunfire and bombs. This wasn't the sanitized warfare of strategic bombing, where targets were often distant blurs. This was combat at its most visceral and direct. Critics would later question whether such modifications represented legitimate military innovation or dangerous improvisation that unnecessarily endangered aircrews. Flying at mast height exposed bombers, typically large and relatively slow, to every form of anti-aircraft fire the enemy possessed, everything from small arms to heavy naval guns. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, one flak burst, and an entire crew would be lost. It was an incredibly dangerous mission profile, and the courage required was immense. But Papi Gun understood something that his critics missed. In the Pacific War, half measures meant defeat. The Japanese were winning because they were willing to accept staggering casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. Their pilots flew until their last drop of fuel or their planes fell apart. Their soldiers fought to the last man. American forces had to be equally ruthless, equally innovative, equally willing to risk everything to achieve victory. The 8-gun nose wasn't just a weapon modification. It was a declaration that America would fight this war with every tool, every innovation, every desperate measure at its disposal. It was a commitment to victory, whatever the cost. Now, let's set the stage for the moment of truth. March 3rd, 1943. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea. 8 Japanese transports, escorted by 8 destroyers, were carrying nearly 7,000 troops and critical supplies. Their destination, Japanese positions in New Guinea. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was a routine operation, another convoy making the run from Rabaul to Lai, just as dozens had done before. They were confident, perhaps even complacent, believing they understood the parameters of the fight. But this time they faced something entirely new. At 10:15 a.m., 13 B-25, Mitchell bombers appeared on the horizon. Not as distant dots in the sky, but flying in perfect, disciplined formation, just 50 feet above the Pacific swells. To Japanese lookouts, they might have appeared to be ordinary American medium bombers, perhaps preparing for another ineffective high-altitude attack. They could not have been more wrong. As the B-25s closed to attack range, their noses erupted in flame. 8 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft, over 100 heavy machine guns in total, began pouring rounds into the Japanese ships at an astonishing rate of 8,000 bullets per minute. The concentrated firepower was unlike anything the Imperial Navy had ever faced. It was a hail of lead that shredded everything in its path. Ships' crews were literally swept from their stations, cut down before they could even understand the nature of the attack. Anti-aircraft guns, once so formidable against high-flying targets, fell silent as their operators were killed or forced to take cover, huddling uselessly against the overwhelming storm of fire. But the strafing was only the beginning. As the gunships swept across the convoy, they released their skip bombs. 500-pound weapons that bounded across the water and slammed into the ships' hulls below the waterline with devastating force. The Japanese vessels, designed to withstand shell fire from other warships, were completely vulnerable to this new form of attack. Their armor, thick on the decks and superstructure, was paper-thin where it mattered most. The belly of the ship, the part meant to be protected by water, not assaulted by skipping bombs. In a brutal, breathtaking 15 minutes, it was over. 8 transports and 4 destroyers, 3/4 of the entire convoy, lay sinking or burning. Of the 6,900 Japanese troops aboard, fewer than 1,200 would ever reach their destination. The rest were dead, wounded, or would spend the remainder of the war as shipwreck survivors, clinging to wreckage, struggling through shark-infested waters, desperately trying to reach friendly territory. It was a slaughter, a one-sided annihilation that changed everything. The aftermath was immediate and profound. The Japanese Navy would never again attempt to send large convoys across the Bismarck Sea. The era of Japanese expansion in the Pacific was effectively over, ended not by massive fleet actions or strategic bombing campaigns, but by the 8-gun nose of a modified medium bomber conceived in the mind of a mechanic from Arkansas. Papi Gun's innovation had accomplished something that traditional naval warfare could not. It had made convoy operations too costly for the Japanese to sustain. The Emperor's ships could no longer move freely across the Pacific. America had found its ship killer, and it was a weapon the enemy had never imagined could exist. Years later, General George Kenney would write that the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when American air power proved it could dominate the vast ocean spaces that had seemed to belong to Japan forever. And at the heart of that victory was a simple, yet profound truth. Sometimes the most devastating weapons come not from engineering perfection, not from endless research and development, but from the desperate creativity of those who refuse to accept defeat. The 8-gun nose had done more than just sink ships. It had torn holes in Japanese confidence, ripped apart their strategic assumptions, and proven that in war, innovation trumps tradition every single time. Paul Papi Gun, the 6th-grade dropout from Arkansas, had changed the course of history with nothing more than salvaged machine guns, a deep understanding of aircraft, and the courage to ignore every rule in the book. That's the true power of American heroism, and indeed, human ingenuity. It's not the ability to follow orders blindly, but the wisdom to know when to break them. It's not the strength to accept limitations, but the vision to see beyond them, to envision possibilities where others see only roadblocks. When those 8 guns in that B-25's nose opened fire on March 3, 1943, they didn't just announce the arrival of a new weapon. They declared that America would never stop innovating, never stop adapting, never stop finding new ways to defend freedom and overcome overwhelming odds. The Japanese had taught America a hard lesson at Pearl Harbor, that surprise attacks could change the course of history. But in the skies above the Bismarck Sea, America returned the favor with interest. The student had become the teacher, and the lesson was written in 50-caliber rounds and skip bombs. 8 guns. 15 minutes. The beginning of the end for Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. That's the day Japan faced the B-25's 8-gun nose and realized it could tear ships in half. So, what's the lesson for us today, far removed from the battlefields of World War II? It's that true innovation often starts with a refusal to accept impossible. It's about the mechanic in the garage, the entrepreneur in the basement, the artist defying convention, all fueled by a vision that others can't yet see. It's about empowering those closest to the problem, the ones who truly understand its nuances, and giving them the freedom to experiment, even if it means breaking a few rules. Papi Gun's story reminds us that desperate times often call for audacious solutions, and that the greatest victories are often forged not by following the established path, but by courageously blazing a new one. It's a testament to the enduring power of human spirit, resilience, and the relentless drive to innovate against all odds.